Well, we are in Hebrews today because we're starting a new series, and what I thought we would do is to link the teaching from last year's Sunday series on the Old Testament. If you remember that far back, maybe you don't remember that far back. If you do, around September time till Christmas, we did a sweep of the Old Testament, sort of what the overall story was in the Old Testament. I wanted to link that to the New Testament, to how it fits in with what we believe about Jesus Christ. And I think the best way to do this is to look at the book of Hebrews, because the book of Hebrews does that for us. So before we read the first chapter, let me set the scene for you a little in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians. So they're people who were Jews, but they had converted to Christianity. They were Jews, followed the Old Testament law, had the Old Testament as their scriptures, but they had converted to follow Jesus Christ. Okay, that's who this writer was writing to. So if I was to ask you, for example, what did the Jews believe, or what was important to the Jews? I wonder what you would say. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot and ask you to shout out answers. Maybe you wouldn't like to do that. But think to yourself, what was important to the Jews? And one of the things that you might have in your head, if I was to ask you to shout out, is the scriptures. The law was a big, important thing to the Jews. What we call the Torah, which means teaching. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament given to them by Moses. That was so important to the Jews. And this is a huge thing. So they believed in the law and the prophets and the writings of the Old Testament. That was their scriptures in the Old Testament. But they were waiting for this Messiah to come, this Christ. And if you know, Messiah or Christ means anointed one. That's what it means. They were waiting for this promised Messiah who would bring healing to the nations, who would restore sight to the blind, set the captives free. They're waiting for this Messiah to come. And the Jews today are still waiting for this Messiah to come. That's the sad thing. Jews today don't believe that Jesus was or is the Messiah. They don't believe he is the Christ. They believe he is just an ordinary man in a sense, or maybe a prophet, but they don't believe that he is the Messiah, the one that the Old Testament is pointing to. And the Jews back then didn't either. Jews today don't believe that either. And so anyone who was a Jew and now follows Jesus is in a sorry state to the Jews. Think about that. If you're a Jew and you see someone who was a Jew and now they're following this man who calls himself the Messiah, they're in a sorry state because the Jews don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. You're following someone, you're following a false Messiah. It's pretty much what they're thinking. So the writer of Hebrews is writing to Christians who were Jews, but who believe in Jesus as the promised Messiah, what we call Messianic Jews today. And many of these Jews Christians are being persecuted because of their conversion. Don't forget, to the Jews, these Christian converts were blaspheming by worshipping this Jesus who calls himself the Messiah, who calls himself the Son of God, the Son of Man. This is blasphemy. This is worthy of stoning. So people are being persecuted. The Christians are being persecuted. So the writer of Hebrews wants to write to them to encourage them to hold on to the faith. And we see that a lot later on at the book, near the end of the book, in chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11 is one of the sort of famous chapters where it lists all the Old Testament heroes and how much faith they had. And the writer is saying, hold on to that faith. So he's writing to them to remind them of what they have in Christ. And so he starts the letter by taking the things that Jews hold on to strongly: angels, the law, the prophets, priests. And he says that Jesus is far superior to all these things. So we're going to read it in a second, but before we get there, N.T. Wright gave this analogy. You know the way children sometimes get presents? And they unwrap the present and they have a box maybe, and they open the box and they take the present out, and then they spend time playing with the box rather than the present. N.T. Wright says that's like what the Jews were doing with the Old Testament. It's like the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, is all pointing forward to Jesus. Jesus is the present in the box. And the Old Testament is the wrapping of the box, or the box itself, not the actual present. And the Jews are so fixated on the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, which point to Jesus, but they're so busy playing with the wrapping paper rather than looking at the actual present or the gift of Jesus Christ. And that's what's going on here. The Jews are fascinated with the box, with the wrapping, rather than focusing on the gift of Jesus. And in a sense, what they were doing was committing idolatry. They were making an idol of the law. They were holding the law up on a pedestal rather than worshipping God himself. So, with all that in mind, look at verse 1 of Hebrews 1. Let's read the first chapter together. So the writer of Hebrews says this: in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. Excuse me. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. And so he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have become your father"? Or again, "I will be his father and he will be my son"? And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." And speaking of the angels, he says, he makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be in the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy." He also says, "In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment they will be changed, but you remain the same, and your years will never end." To which of the angels did God ever say, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? Now look at verse 1. The writer is straight in here in verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets in many times and in various ways. But these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. So the writer here has gotten right into it. There's no greetings here. There's no "to my dear so-and-so, grace and peace to you," like Paul would write in his letters. Whoever wrote this, and we don't know who it is, by the way, people used to think it was Paul. I think in the Authorized Version, the King James Version, it does say Paul. But scholars have analysed the language used and the way the words are used, and they've run computer statistical analysis on the language that's used, and they've come to the conclusion that whoever wrote this letter, it's not Paul. It's someone else. But the point is this. The writer is saying, listen, you Christians. You Christians who were once Jews, you used to be Jews, you used to follow the Old Testament, you loved the law and the prophets, and they're good and they're great, but they're the wrapping of the box. Jesus is the gift. But you Christians who were once Jews, who know your Old Testament back to front, don't forget, God spoke to us in the past. Look at verse 1. In the past, God spoke to us through the prophets in many times and in various ways, but in these last days, in these recent days, he's spoken to us through his Son, the one who made the universe. And so right at the start, what the writer wants us to see, I want the Hebrew people, the Jewish Christians to see, is that Jesus is better than the prophets. The Jews held the prophets in high regard. This writer is saying Jesus is better than them. He's God's Son. And then he hammers it home in the next verses. Look at verse 3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So the words that the writer uses here for the exact representation is where we get the word character. The Greek word is character. That's where we get our English word character. Now, if you think of the word character, it can mean a few different things. Your character is your person, who you are and yourself. That's your character, isn't it? So you say oh, that person's a great character. But a character also is the letters that we use. You think of the letters that we write, they're called characters as well. And so this also conveys what happens when a letter is written, especially from royalty. A king would write a scroll, and they'd write the scroll, and they'd roll it up, and they'd melt some wax, and they'd seal the scroll up with the wax, and then the king would use a signet ring, and they would use the signet ring to make an imprint on the wax. And that was the royal seal on the wax. And the image on the ring is transferred to the wax. What is on the wax is an exact representation of what's on the signet ring. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying that Jesus is the exact image of God himself. Now, this is something we've grown up with. We've always been taught this. But to these people who are reading this, they need to hear this because they're following this Jesus guy. They're new Christians. They've heard about Jesus. Maybe some of them didn't even meet him. Maybe some of them have. They may have heard about Jesus from other people, and they're following him. They're putting their faith in him. And they're being persecuted because of it. This guy isn't the Messiah, and they're being persecuted and maybe even stoned for it. The writer of Hebrews is saying, this guy Jesus, he's the exact representation of God himself. He's not just any prophet. He's much better than the prophets. God has been speaking to us through Jesus in these last days. Much better than any prophet because he's the exact representation of God. In comparison, the prophets were like a children's drawing of God. Jesus is the exact representation, the carbon copy. But look at the last few words at the end of verse 3 because I think these are interesting. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Now, the writer touches on this later on in the book. Turn over to Hebrews 10 for a second. I want to show you something from Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10 and verse 11. Now look at what it says here. And keep in mind what it says in verse 3 of chapter 1. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Look at verse 11 of Hebrews 10. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. Now, what he's saying is the high priest, the priest in the temple, every day stood and performed his duties. They made the sacrifices every day. And those sacrifices, he even says himself, the sacrifices can never take away sins. They didn't do that. They were pointing forward to the sacrifice that Jesus would make that would take away sins. But notice the words he uses. Every day the priest, what does he do? He stands and performs his duty. And he does this every day because every day there are sacrifices to be made. Every day there are duties to perform. I heard Brian Chappell preach on this, and he pointed out that in the temple, when God lists all the different things in the temple, in the tabernacle, there's so many different items of furniture and different pieces that have to be made. There's one thing that's missing in the temple and in the tabernacle, and it's a chair. There are no chairs in the tabernacle because the priests didn't have time to sit down. They were standing all the time. But look at the next verse. Look at verse 12 of chapter 10. But when this priest, talking about Jesus, when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, what did he do? He sat down at the right hand of God. Jesus sat down. The priest offered sacrifices again and again and again, and they never took away sin. They were incomplete. What did Jesus do? He offered his sacrifice once for all time, and it did take away sin. And what did he do after that? He sat down because it is finished. He didn't have any more to do. Isn't that amazing? It tells them that Jesus is far superior than the priests. So Jesus is far superior than the prophets. He's far superior than the priests as well. Now, go back to chapter 1 and look at verses 4 and 5, because the author goes on to speak about Jesus being better than the angels, and that's kind of the rest of the chapter. Look at verses 4 and 5 there of Hebrews 1. It says, "So he became much superior to the angels, as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have become your father'? Or again, 'I will be his father and he will be my son'?" Now go down to verse 13. You'll see the phrase again, "To which of the angels did God ever say?" Do you see that? You'll see these things in the Bible. You'll see a phrase, and then you'll see a few verses maybe in between, or a few sentences, and then you'll see the same phrase repeated. That's an ancient writing technique that sort of bookends a point in the middle. And the point in the middle is this: Jesus is far superior than the angels. What the author does here is he gives a few extracts from the Old Testament that refer to Jesus. Now, the Jews didn't realize it referred to Jesus, but they do refer to Jesus. And so look at verse 5. He says that no angel is called the Son of God. No angel is called the Son of God. God didn't say that to any of the angels, but he said it to Jesus. Verse 6. No angel is worshipped by other angels, but Jesus the Son is. Verse 8. No angel is God, but the Son is God. And look at the words it says there in verse 8. Your throne, O God. You see that? To the Son he says, your throne, O God. You see, if you get a Jehovah's Witness around your house, they don't believe that Jesus is God. They don't believe in that. Now, John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. They don't believe that's translated correctly. They believe that it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was like a God, as opposed to the Word was God. But here in verse 8 of Hebrews 1, it says, God is saying to Jesus, your throne, O God, will last forever. God is calling Jesus God. The Father is calling Jesus God. This is hammering home the point to the Jews that Jesus is far superior than the prophets and the priests and the angels. He is far superior than all of these things. Now, this is a critical time, or this is critical at a time of persecution. Maybe some people are thinking, you know what, I'm going to go back to the old way of following the law and the Moses and doing all these rituals and so on. And then they read this letter of encouragement telling them, hold on to the faith. You're following Jesus. You're following the Son of God. Jesus is far superior to all these things. Just hold on to that faith. And I suppose it's good for us as well. Maybe sometimes people feel like throwing in the towel in their Christian life. I'm following Jesus, and you know what? All these things are coming at me, and I feel like just giving it all up. And the encouragement is still the same. Hold on to the faith. Jesus is far superior than anything else in the world. He's far superior than all the things that attract us in the world. Those things they're like trinkets. Jesus is the present. He is the gift for us. Hold on to the faith. And so we have the first 4 verses of chapter 2, and with this we'll close. Look at the first 4 verses of chapter 2. Because of all that, there's a therefore in there, we must pay the most careful attention to what we have heard. So because Jesus is more superior than the angels and the prophets and the priests, we've got to pay more attention to what we've heard from Jesus so that we don't drift away. For since the message spoken through the angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts by the Holy Spirit, distributed according to his will. In other words, what the author of Hebrews is saying is, if the message of the angels was binding and reliable, and the message of the prophets were binding and reliable, and the law of Moses was binding and reliable, Jesus is better than all of these things. So we need to pay more careful attention to what he tells us. And we've got to follow it. Because if we don't follow it, how shall we escape the punishment if we ignore it? Got to follow what Jesus says, the writer of Hebrews is saying. You've got to follow what he says. I mean, you think the law is binding and you're following the law. What Jesus says is so much more important. It's so much more superior than the law. So you've got to follow it. And if you ignore it, how are you going to escape the punishment that's coming? You won't. How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? The salvation that Jesus offers us is so great and superior than anything else. And if we ignore it, if we cast it aside, if we follow our own desires or our own traditions, which the Jews were so good at following, if we ignore the commands of Jesus and the gospel he gives, how shall we escape? The question is left open because we can't escape. Now, this isn't a sermon, but at the same time, I think it's relevant for us on different levels. And one of the levels is when I think about the traditions of the Jews and what they put their faith and their hope in. We have our own traditions in our church, let's face it, don't we? We have our own traditions in our society and in our culture, in our land. Some good traditions, some traditions, let's face it, perhaps are a hindrance to the gospel. Some traditions we have are maybe a hindrance to the proclamation of the gospel. The question is this: is Jesus far superior to these traditions that we have in our land, in our church maybe even? Should we follow our traditions over and above the teachings of Jesus? Or should we follow the teachings of Jesus over and above the traditions that we have in our land or our church? Do we hold on to tradition for the sake of tradition, even if it hinders the good news of Jesus Christ? Are we making idols of our traditions or our historical roots? Are we making idols of them so that we don't let go of them and follow the teaching of Jesus? Are they becoming idols to us? Are they replacing Jesus as the main thing? Or do we see Jesus as being more superior than our traditions? Do we follow what he says, even if it means putting some of our traditions aside or putting them to bed for the sake of Jesus Christ? I'll leave that one with you. But given what the writer of Hebrews has written here, I think we perhaps know the answer to that.